bar for Iran and essentially laying the groundwork for a conflict.
Gentlelady from Florida.
Mr. Speaker, I reserve the right to close.
Gentlelady reserves her time. Gentleman from California.
I'm very pleased to yield 1 minute to a former member of the Foreign Affairs Committee, my friend from Texas, the gentlelady Sheila Jackson Lee. 1 minute.
Gentlelady from Texas is recognized for 1 minute.
I thank the ranking member and the chairwoman of this committee for bringing us together. And I don't like sanctions, Mr. Speaker, but I rise in strong support of this legislation. And when I say that, I understand what sanctions can do to women and children and families. In fact, I'm reminded of the debate on apartheid and sanctions in South Africa. And that debate was a question of whether you undermine that nation. But we saw what happened with sanctions when we came together as a nation to bring down the dastardly structure of apartheid. Iran right now today can stop this legislation by shedding itself of all signs of building a nuclear weapon. The regime change is not by war. This bill does not suggest war. It means that voluntarily by election, their governments can change. But what I believe is most important is that we recognize, having seen that fallen woman bleeding in the street, that human rights abuses are massive. They're massive in their influence of Iraq, where they're influencing the treatment of residents of Camp Ashraf. That must stop. And so this legislation is crucial because it impacts the human rights abuses. It indicates that there is no giving on a nuclear weapon, and it gives Iran right now today the ability to stop this legislation and sanctions by owning up to eliminating any sign of a nuclear weaponization and treating its people with dignity and responding to the needs of the people in Camp Ashraf. I support the legislation.
Has expired.
I thank the gentleman. I support the legislation enthusiastically and yield back.
Has expired. Gentleman from Ohio.
Me and myself, 30 seconds.
Gentleman is recognized.
Collectively, the provisions in this bill move the goalposts from negotiations over Iran's nuclear enrichment program to regime change. I just want to point out the record of our country on regime change isn't all that good. Yes, we knocked out Saddam Hussein under the lie that he had weapons of mass destruction, and now al-Qaeda's all over Iraq. So what are we about here? Are we setting a stage for another war where we siphon the revenue out of this country, send it to war machines, can't meet our own needs? Since when does Iran achieve greater importance than our own country? That's what I want to know. I want somebody to explain that to me. I reserve.
Gentleman reserves his time. Does the gentlelady from Florida continue to reserve? Gentlelady reserves. Gentleman from California.
Mr. Speaker, could I get another indication of the time remaining to...
Gentleman from California has 4.5 minutes remaining. The gentleman from Ohio has 3 minutes remaining.
And the gentlelady from Florida?
And the gentlelady from Florida has 30 seconds.
Oh, okay. In this case, I'm pleased to yield a minute and a half to the ranking member of the Western Hemisphere Subcommittee, a longtime member and leader on the Foreign Affairs Committee, and a very active legislator on the issue before us today. That is the effort to stop Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. My friend, Mr. Engel, for a minute and a half.
Gentleman from New York is recognized for 1.5 minutes.
I thank my friend for yielding to me, and I rise in strong support of this legislation. And I'm glad that the Senate and the House finally came together on this very, very important bill. This bill has very, very strong support, as you can tell, on both sides of the aisle. And the reason it does is because Iran has proven itself to be a very, very dangerous player. Iran is the leading supporter of terrorism in the world. Iran supplies and supports the terrorist group Hezbollah in Lebanon. And in fact, now we see what's going on in Syria, and if it was not for Iran, Assad would not be able to continue his brutal ways and his murdering of his own people. Right now, as we talk, there are Iranian guards fighting on the side of Assad in Syria, and Iran chooses to be and continues to be a rogue nation. Iran must not be allowed to have a nuclear weapon. She has lied to the world consistently in talking about her purposes of the weapon, but Iran is not fooling anybody. And so what these sanctions do is it hits at Iran's oil and natural gas sectors, making it very, very difficult for them to launder money and making it very, very difficult to continue their repressive ways. The world has spoken. This isn't only the United States. These are countries all over the world. And unfortunately, with the blocking of some vetoes in the United Nations, there would be sanctions in Iran. So I urge my colleagues to support this. I think there's a reason why virtually every member of Congress on both sides of the aisle supports it, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Ohio.
I yield myself 1 minute.
Gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
These sanctions are hurting ordinary people in Iran. I pointed out earlier, matters like the price of rent, bread. Americans can understand that. Education. All of these things are increasing. And these sanctions then directly undermine Iran's civil society by giving the regime a chance to crack down even harder on internal dissent. These sanctions will ensure that those crackdowns continue. Ordinary Iranians are struggling simply to make ends meet under this sanctions regime that already exists. They cannot afford to spend the times necessary to participate in social movements which provide basic social services to push for democratic change in their country. Are these the intended effects that we wish to have on the Iranian people and Iranian Americans? And if not, passing this kind of a broad, indiscriminate sanctions bill sends the wrong message. If the sanctions imposed on Iraq are any precedent, we know that sanctions are not an effective tool in promoting or supporting domestic democracy movements. We also know those sanctions did not prevent an unnecessary and wasteful war with Iraq. In effect, the expansion of the broad and indiscriminate sanctions, including this legislation, hurts our ability to negotiate with Iran, imposes long-term harm detrimental to the Iranian people. I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. Gentlelady from Florida continues to reserve. Gentleman from California.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I'm going to yield myself such time as I may consume. I have no further requests for time. And I'd like to just raise a couple of the issues that my friends from Mr. Paul from Texas and Mr. Kucinich from Ohio have put forth in the context of opposition to this bill. This is not the next step to war. This is the alternative to war. Iran having a nuclear weapon is unacceptable for many, many reasons. It means the end of the non-proliferation regime. It means countries all through that part of the world will seek their own nuclear weapons. It raises the specter of nuclear weapons being passed on and dirty bombs being passed on to terrorists. And there is nothing in the comments of the regime that could let one relax and think they would never be the first to use those nuclear weapons. That is unacceptable. Our alternatives are either war or finding a diplomatic resolution of their nuclear weapons program, the end of that program. They've been found not by the White House, not by some Vulcans in foreign policy, but by the IAEA and the UN Security Council over and over again to have violated their obligations under the Non-Proliferation Treaty to which they are a signatory to. They don't ratify the additional protocols. They move ahead with enrichment plants that they don't need for a peaceful nuclear weapons program. They do not have a right to enrich. You could argue they have a right to a nuclear energy program, but not a right to enrich. They conceal information in violation of their treaty obligations. This is hopefully the final step, but if not, we will have to intensify the sanctions to achieve that diplomatic program. And Iran is not some bucolic, peace-loving state that has never done anything against its neighbors. Everyone knows that Hezbollah is a direct foreign agent of Iran that gets its funding, its training, and its sponsorship, and its directions from Iran. We know what they've done to the Marines in Lebanon. We've known what they tried to do to the Saudi ambassador here in Washington. We know that in Delhi and in Bulgaria and a number of other capitals around the world, their effort to commit terrorist acts against Israeli diplomats and Israeli citizens, their record as a state sponsor of terror is the largest and most impactful in the world. They are pursuing a nuclear weapons capability. It is our obligation to do every measure we can to stop them from getting that, and we want to do it peacefully. This strategy that we are embarked on is an effort to find a way to do this without resorting to war, and I urge my colleagues to stand strongly behind this bill. This is the alternative. It is the only feasible alternative. Otherwise, we are faced with two very dismal prospects: a military action or an Iran with nuclear weapons and all that means. I urge and I vote and yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from Ohio.
I yield myself 1 minute.
Gentleman is recognized.
Sanctions are a form of war in this case, and they will lead to war. And remember, we're not talking about, some time ago we were talking about if Iran would have a nuclear weapon. But then the bar's been lowered to say nuclear weapon capability. And now the game's being changed to say not just nuclear weapon capability, but we want regime change as well. I mean, if this isn't a prescription for war, then I didn't participate in the debate in this House of Representatives in October of 2002 warning this Congress, chapter and verse, that Iraq had no weapons of mass destruction, no role with al-Qaeda in 9/11, did not have any intention or capability of attacking the United States. This is a version of that debate all over again. I mean, come on, what are we doing here? Why is this more important than our country? You know, our Postal Service is going into default tonight, a manufacturer default, minded. No debate on the House floor about this today, but an attempt to manufacture a war with Iran. What are we about?
Does the gentlelady from Florida continue to reserve?
Correct. I will retain my time to close, so if Mr. Kucinich could wrap up his part of the debate,
Gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
Could I ask how much time remains? Pardon?
Gentleman has 1 minute remaining.
The gentlelady?
Gentleman from Ohio has 1 minute
remaining. And how much time does the gentlelady have?
Gentlelady from Florida has 30 seconds remaining.
Okay. So, fine.
Is it okay?
I yield myself 1 minute.
Gentleman is recognized.
This legislation also requires the President to impose sanctions on those who are responsible for or complicit in certain human rights abuses in Syria. But it fails to acknowledge that our own country and a number of our allies are actively participating in stoking the violence on the ground. Divisions and infighting within the various militias operating on the ground are already occurring. And we also read that al-Qaeda's also been involved in Syria. So, look. We have to get serious about what America's purpose is in the world. It's not to be a heavy foot. It's not to proliferate wars all over. The first thing we have to do is take care of things here at home. Jobs for all, health care for all, education for all, retirement security for all. When we can do those kind of things, you know, then we can pretend that we can be the policeman of the world. But until we've done that, we don't have any right to go all around the world trying to tell people how to live. And we can settle this matter with Iran without war. We can settle it through diplomacy. Diplomacy. It'd be real interesting to try it. And we ought to support any efforts of the Obama administration to use diplomacy here. Let's not use this political climate to push us into a war.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentlelady from Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I ask unanimous consent to place into the record an exchange of letters with the Chairman of the Committee on Energy and Commerce, Mr. Upton.
Without objection.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, I yield myself the remaining time.
Gentlelady is recognized for 30 seconds.
I appreciate it. Thank you. I'd like to recognize the commitment, the dedication, and tireless efforts of the members of our House Foreign Affairs Committee, Mille, particularly our staff director, Dr. Yelem Poblet, who Ranking Member Berman once described as driving a hard bargain. Just ask her hubby, Jason. Also, thanks to Matt Zweig and Ari Friedman. Thanks to Chairman Johnson of the Senate Banking Committee and his staff, particularly Colin McGuinness, Patrick Grant, and Steve Kroll, as well as Ranking Member Shelby and his staff. A strong and warm thanks and a big hug to my good friend, Mr. Berman, the Ranking Member, and his staff, particularly Shanna Winters, Alan Makovsky, and Ed Rice, as well as Minority Staff Director Richard Kessler. And I'd like to thank Senators Menendez and Mark Kirk and the critical representatives Deutsch, Sherman, and Dold. Let's stop Iran before it's too late. Let's pass this bill. I yield back.
Thank time has expired. All time for debate has expired. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and agree to House Resolution 750? Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. Opinion of the chair, two-thirds being in the affirmative. Gentlelady from Florida.
On that, I request the yeas and nays.
Yeas and nays are requested. All those in favor of taking this vote by the yeas and nays will rise and remain standing until counted. Sufficient number having risen, the yeas and nays are ordered. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20 and the chair's prior announcement, further proceedings on this motion will be postponed. For what purpose does the gentleman from Michigan seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, pursuant to House Resolution 747, I call up the bill H.R. 8, the Job Protection and Recession Prevention Act of 2012, and ask for its immediate consideration.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 8, a bill to extend certain tax relief provisions enacted in 2001 and 2003 and for other purposes.
Pursuant to House Resolution 747, the bill is considered read. After 1 hour debate on the bill, it shall be in order to consider the amendment in the nature of a substitute printed in Part B of House Report 112-641, if offered by the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Levin, or his designee, which shall be considered read and shall be separately debatable, minutes equally divided and controlled by the proponent and an opponent. The gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Camp, and the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Levin, each will control 30 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Camp.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and to include extraneous material on H.R. 8. And, Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Without objection, and the gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today in support of H.R. 8, the Jobs Protection and Recession Prevention Act. In doing so, I and my fellow Republican House colleagues have made an important choice, the choice to focus on job creation. Unfortunately, my colleagues on the other side of the aisle who oppose this important piece of legislation have made a different choice, the choice to focus on tax hikes that destroy jobs. The Jobs Protection and Recession Prevention Act stops the tax hike we face at the end of the year and provides a one-year extension of the low tax policies originally enacted in 2001 and 2003, and then extended again in 2010. The 2010 bill was supported by 85 current House Democrats, 40 current Senate Democrats, and President Obama. Importantly, this legislation allows Congress time to pass and enact comprehensive tax reform without causing undue harm to our fragile economy. Economists have noted that comprehensive tax reform, when paired with appropriate government spending cuts, could lead to the creation of 1 million American jobs in the first year alone. The choice Republicans have made is to pass this bill, work toward comprehensive tax reform, and create jobs. In contrast, my Democrat colleagues have proposed raising taxes. They claim the tax hike will only affect the rich. What they don't want to tell you is that in reality, this tax hike will hit nearly 1 million small businesses and 53% of small business income. A study conducted by Ernst & Young concluded that the Democrat tax hike could lead to the loss of over 700,000 jobs. That's the choice that Democrats have made, to raise taxes on families and small businesses and destroy jobs. America is at a crossroads, as this chart illustrates. And the question is, which path will our country take? The Democrats' path includes tax hikes that will cause small businesses to lose 700,000 jobs, or the Republicans' tax reform path that will make the tax code simpler and fairer and lead to the creation of more than 1 million jobs in the first year. What's even worse is that in their quest to raise taxes on the so-called wealthy, several of my Democrat colleagues have made it clear that they're willing to hold low and middle-income Americans hostage by threatening to let all taxes rise as scheduled at the end of the year if they don't get their way. Now, these massive and imminent tax hikes are part of the fiscal cliff, or jobs cliff, as I often refer to it, that we face at the end of this year. The nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office estimates that going over the fiscal cliff could cost America 2 to 3 million jobs. This would be a devastating blow to almost 13 million Americans who are unemployed, as well as to the middle class Americans who have been struggling in the Obama economy. Now, Mr. Speaker, the choice to me is obvious. Let's pass this bill. Let's work toward comprehensive tax reform that creates a simpler, fairer tax code for all Americans, most importantly, that creates the jobs we so badly need. I urge my colleagues on the other side of the aisle to reconsider their choice to increase taxes and destroy over 700,000 jobs. Now's not the time to dig the hole we're in any deeper. Instead, Democrats should take the advice of people like President Bill Clinton and former economic advisor to President Obama, Larry Summers, and join Republicans to stop the tax hike, work to strengthen our economy, and get our country back on track. And I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves his time. Gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Levin.
I yield myself such time as I shall consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
There is a choice to be made here, and it isn't what the chairman has put forth for 1 second. Everyone in this body agrees that we should extend the middle class tax cut. The Senate passed a bill that does just that. The President is ready to sign it this week. The middle class families of this country need certainty, not some vague promises about something to be done in the future. So the question is, if everybody agrees that we should continue the middle class tax cut, why don't we come together? And the answer is this. The Senate bill continues all of the tax cuts for every American household on their first $250,000 of income. 114 million families would see their tax cuts extended in full. 97% of small businesses would keep all of their tax cuts according to the Joint Tax Committee. 97%. So why don't the Republicans join us in acting? I think the answer is clear. This chart shows it. They're insistent. Their priority is cutting taxes for the very wealthy. They want to give households that earn more than $1 million a year a tax cut on average of $160,000. This chart shows it. What we have here for middle-class families, $2,200. For the very wealthy, $160,000. That's over 70 times more a tax cut for millionaires than for typical families. And what makes it worse, if possible, is it would add $49 billion to the deficit. This Republican bill also would raise taxes on 25 million families. 25. Those who've benefited from the EITC, from the child tax credit, and a higher education tax cut, which they would credit that they would eliminate altogether. And it's still worse. The bill we're going to discuss tomorrow, so-called tax reform, essentially would provide someone earning more than $1 million a $331,000 tax cut. This debate is not about tax reform. It's about whether or not we protect the very wealthy at all costs. At all costs, for middle-income families, for everybody except the very wealthy. This talk about 700,000 jobs being lost, that study financed by special interest friends, it's been discredited by every fact checker. And you know, they're talking about 70 times more for the millionaire than for middle-income families on average, when in 2011, 93% of income growth went to the top 1% of wealthy households. 93%. And they come here and say, as their first priority, is protecting the very wealthy. No, this isn't about tax reform. We need to work on this. This is about whether the first priority of the Republicans is protecting the very wealthy, holding hostage middle-income families. Let the middle-income family hostages be released. Be released. Join together for what everybody says they're for. Let's pass today our substitute and give a middle-income tax cut to everybody, including 97% of small businesses. I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman's time is reserved. Gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Kemp.
Thank you. At this time, I yield 2 minutes to the distinguished chairman of the Health Subcommittee, the gentleman from California, Mr. Herger.
Gentleman from California is recognized for 2 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, this House must act to stop the midnight tax hike that threatens to hit all American taxpayers on December 31st. This midnight menace includes a 50% cut in the value of the child tax credit, higher taxes on dividends for seniors living on fixed income, the return of the infamous marriage penalty for working families, and the alternative minimum tax ensnaring middle-income taxpayers. An average family of 4 with an income of $50,000 could see a tax increase of almost $2,200 a year. The President says he wants to stop the midnight tax hike for some taxpayers, but not all. He claims that he merely wants the wealthy to pay more. But the truth is that his tax increase proposal would especially hit small business owners. As someone who comes from a small business background myself, I understand that many small businesses pay taxes as individuals. Their income includes money that they reinvest in the business to expand and hire more workers. A big tax increase could harm the very businesses we are relying on to create more jobs. In fact, a new study by Ernst & Young suggests that the President's tax proposal would cost more than 700,000 American jobs. Mr. Speaker, what lane will you choose? I urge the House to pass H.R. 8 and prevent a tax hike for all Americans. I yield back.
Gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Levin.
Myself 10 seconds.
Gentleman is recognized.
When you look at Mr. Herger's district, he's standing up to protect 180 people who have income over $1 million, sacrificing a middle income tax cut for 285,000. I now yield 2 minutes to the very distinguished chairman, former chairman, and a gentleman from New York, Mr. Rangel.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman from New York is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you so much. I've never been so fortunate in this House to have the Republicans state the argument as clearly as they had this afternoon. And I think Wally Herger said it. It is possible, not that we're talking about a tax cut. People working every day trying to make ends meet, they don't know the wonderful tax cut that they are enjoying. But you bet your life, if we don't come together, if we don't reach agreement, they'll understand what a tax hike is, and that's exactly what's going to happen to 98% of the tax-paying people of this great country. Taxpayers who work every day, who raise their families, who buy from the local merchants that keep small business alive, are going to find out, probably too late, that the Republican Party says you don't deserve the lower tax rate. And then they may ask, well, what's holding this up if everyone agrees that they should have it? Well, we're going to have to explain to the middle class what the Republicans are explaining to us, that somehow we are to believe that less than 2% of the population is creating the jobs and really supporting the economy. Well, I don't know where they've been or how they're going to come back, but they haven't been creating jobs and they haven't been spending and investing money. But even if there was a controversy, why in the heck are we holding hostage 98% of the people? If Republicans agree, and Democrats agree, and liberal and conservatives and even Tea Party people agree, that these people who work hard every day should continue to have this tax cut, then why in the heck don't we agree to give it to them? And if it ever becomes that we're in a political debate, and it's only about less than 2% of 100%, then let's fight like the devil over that and see who prevails. But it's not going to be hard for us to explain this. If you do this to the hard-working American people, shame on you.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Camp.
I yield 3 minutes to a distinguished member of the Ways and Means Committee, the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Roscom.
Gentleman from Illinois is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the gentleman for yielding. You know, I'd like to pause and just listen and think through a couple of the arguments that we've been hearing over the past couple of weeks from our friends on the other side of the aisle and from the President of the United States, and one is that people should pay their fair share. Now, that's an interesting argument, Mr. Speaker, and let's look at that a little bit closer. So if the President's will were to prevail on this, in other words, if this tax hike goes into place, then the top tax rate for some small businesses would be over 44%. Now, contrast that to the top tax rate that President Obama is proposing would be 28%. Now, all afternoon, you're going to hear a lot of things go back and forth, but you won't hear anyone contradict those numbers and that disparity, Mr. Speaker, because they are true. There is no sense in telling corporations you get a 28% rate and the top rate for small business is 44%. There's nothing fair about that. All right, well, let's look at another argument. Another argument is that this somehow closes a budget gap and this is deficit reduction and we're all about deficit reduction and let's have at it. Well, the little secret on the deficit reduction is at best, the most generous estimate is this would take care of, what, maybe 7, 8, 9, 10 days of spending, maybe? But who would pay the cost for that? I'll tell you who pays the cost for that. The job creators and the people that are looking for jobs right now, Mr. Speaker. According to Ernst & Young and others that have looked at this, some estimates are that it would cost 700,000 jobs. Now, I know nobody that is willing to say, you know what, we just got too many jobs. Let's just thin the herd. There's too many people working. Let's thin the herd. There's too many people working, and let's do it because of Democratic dogma. We've got leading Democrats on the other side of the rotunda who have said, let's embrace the fiscal cliff. Let's just grab onto the dogma and go right off the cliff regardless of the outcome. Well, you know what? That's ridiculous. And we have an opportunity here to make some certainty, to move to the next year, not to move to the next year just to the sake of another year, but to move to next year to fundamentally reform our tax system, to create a more competitive tax code that is broad and fair and wise and well thought out, and that does what? That creates the most competitive tax code in the world right here in the United States. Mr. Speaker, it could be great. We could have a great tax code, but what we've got to do is create a year of certainty to move forward. I urge the passage of this, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time. Gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Levin.
I yield myself 15 seconds.
Gentleman is recognized.
You know, it's ironical that the gentleman from Illinois minimizes adding $50 billion to the deficit over 10 years of continued, which is your policy, continued the high income, $1 trillion. That's something you just shrug your shoulders at? I now yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Oregon, another distinguished member of our committee, Earl Blumenauer.
Gentleman from Oregon is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you. It is an interesting question. Which lane are we going to choose? The study that has been offered by our friends on the other side of the aisle is bogus, and I invite people to actually look at it and look at the critiques that have been offered up. But we've had a real-life experiment, because these tax rates that are being talked about were exactly what we had in the Clinton years, at which time some of our good friends on the other side of the aisle predicted calamity, job loss, the economy would crash. What in fact happened is that we had 22 million jobs that were created. What has happened is that when they had a chance to experiment with their vision in the Bush years, where they put in place these tax reductions, if they would have worked, what would have happened? Did employment even match what happened in the Clinton years? No. In fact, it was barely 5% of what happened in the 8 years of Bill Clinton. In fact, the Obama administration, when it took after the first few months when it was in office and could be credited with responsibility for the economy, has produced more private sector jobs than the entire Bush administration in 8 years. The job loss that's gone negative has been slashing in the public sector, primarily teachers and firefighters and police officers at the state and local level. Mr. Speaker, the strategy here is to continue punting. Our Republican friends are punting on the Farm Bill. Our Republican friends are punting on SGR. They're now proposing a budget solution that gets us past the election because they can't face up to their own Tea Party extremists, and they're split. May I have 30 more seconds?
You have 15 more seconds.
The gentleman is recognized for an additional 15 seconds.
That's what is at stake here. I would suggest that we take what we ought to be able to agree on, the 98% of this tax reduction, agree on that, not punt, give some real certainty, and then have an honest debate about their proposal to increase taxes on the middle class at the expense to be able to provide it for the richest of Americans. Let's have that debate. Let's not hold people hostage in the short term.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Camp.
Thank you. At this time, Mr. Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to the distinguished chairman of the Trade Subcommittee, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Brady.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate Chairman Camp's leadership on this important jobs issue. You know, America, this recovery is the weakest since World War II. It's dead last. Millions of Americans can't find work. Millions of Americans have given up looking for work. Businesses along Main Street are struggling. Business confidence is down, consumer confidence down. This economy is not working. And yet the President has a plan. He gave it to us a couple weeks ago. He said, I want to raise taxes on small businesses and professionals. But here's the cost. In real terms for our economy, 700,000 more Americans will be kicked to the unemployment line. The economy will grow slower. In fact, it'll shrink. Paychecks will shrink. Less investment in America. What kind of plan is that for a recovery? Republicans and also seniors are going to write more checks from capital gains and dividends to Uncle Sam, the dividends they live on. Small businesses will be able to expand less often because of this. Republicans think there's a different choice for America's economy. We want to stop the tax hikes. We want to grow this economy by 1 million new jobs. We want to make sure that you save your whole life as a senior, you invest in dividends and a home and land, that you keep it to survive in your retirement years. We want to make sure the death tax doesn't come back to life. Think about this. You work your whole life to build a family-owned farm or business, and when you die, Uncle Sam swoops in and takes more than half of everything you worked a lifetime to earn. That's the choice between the Republican plan to stop the tax hikes and grow this economy and the President's plan to raise taxes and hurt this economy. It is a clear choice. The House is going to act, and more importantly, we're going to make sure America has the best tax system in the world again so that we can compete and win, so our kids and grandkids have the opportunity for the strongest economy in the world. It's a clear choice. I yield back.
Gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Levin.
I now yield 2 minutes to another gentleman, member of our committee, Mr. Pasquale from the great state of New Jersey.
Gentleman from New Jersey is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Ranking Member. Mr. Speaker, this bill makes it as clear as day just what the priorities of the majority are. Instead of working with us to shift the tax burden away from the middle class, who haven't gotten a raise in a long time, and small businesses, this bill does the exact opposite. And for you to continue to say that this is going to be a burden across the board on small businesses is delusional. 97% of small businesses won't be affected by our bill. To the anti-tax crusaders, this bill will raise taxes on the middle class, your bill, and working poor, your bill, by an average of $1,000. In New Jersey, This bill will make 3.2 million middle-class and working-poor families pay more taxes, so that 231,400 millionaires can get a bigger tax cut. It's as simple as that. You can shake your head all you want. Those are the facts. This bill would add almost $1 trillion more to the deficit than the Democratic bill. My Lord. I don't hear you talk about that. I don't hear you say that. I wonder why. Just so that 0.3% of the taxpayers can get an average tax cut of over $74,000? At least the last time the Republicans took this short-sighted, trickle-down approach, we had a $5.6 trillion surplus, thanks to Bill Clinton. In 2008, we were $11 trillion, over $11 trillion in debt. We quite simply can't afford to give millionaires another tax break and make our children and our grandchildren foot the bill. The proof is in the pudding. In 2000, when we first tried this supply-side voodoo, unemployment was 4.2%. By 2008, 30 seconds.
15 seconds.
The gentleman is recognized for an additional 15 seconds.
Thank you. To those members concerned with tax fairness, today, wealth concentrated with the top 1% is at the same level as the period immediately preceding the Great Depression. So you shrunk the middle class with your great economic ideas between 2001 and 2008, and what you did is made the rich richer. I salute you if that's what you think America is about. We are all job creators, not just the rich.
Regular order, Mr.
Thank you,
Gentleman.
Mr.
Gentleman's
Speaker.
time has expired. Gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Camp.
Thank you. At this time, Mr. Speaker, I yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentleman from Ohio, the Speaker of the House.
Gentleman from Ohio, the Speaker of the House is recognized for 1 minute.
Let me thank my colleague for yielding and remind my colleagues that for the last 18 months that we've been in the majority, we have focused on jobs. The American people are still asking the question, where are the jobs? And that's why we've got over 30 jobs bills now pending over in the United States Senate. And after today, we'll have another bill sitting over in the Senate that will help create more jobs in America. 2 years ago, the President said we shouldn't raise taxes in this time of a slow economy. I agreed with the President. The Congress agreed with the President. All the Republicans and 119 Democrats voted to extend all of the current tax rates. And here we are some 18 months later. Economic growth is actually slower than it was when President Obama made those remarks. And yet the President wants to go out and raise taxes on the so-called rich. Well, let me tell you who the so-called rich are. About 1 million of those people that you want to increase taxes on are small business owners. Small business owners who pay their business taxes through their personal tax return. I know all about this. I used to be one of them. I had a subchapter S corporation, and whatever the company so-called profits were, I had to pay taxes on those, whether I actually got the money or not. And so when you look at what you want to do, what the President wants to do, you want to tax 1 million small business owners. Ernst & Young has come out and made it clear that if you do this, 750,000 jobs are going to be destroyed at a time when the American people are asking, where are the jobs? Listen, it's time to put the rhetoric aside. It's time to put the politics aside. I know we're in an election year, but my goodness, raising taxes at this point in this economy is a very big mistake. Extending all the current tax rates, which our bill does, for 1 year so that we've got time to revise our tax code, lower rates, fairer rates for all Americans, which is what needs to happen if we're truly going to make America more competitive, put more Americans back to work, and bring some of those jobs that have been shipped overseas back home. We all know that we need to revise our tax code and reform it from top to bottom. But that's not going to happen overnight. And so extending all of these rates for 1 year will provide certainty. Certainty for who? Certainty for small business owners, people who can make decisions about what they want to invest in terms of new plant, new equipment, whether they want to hire new employees. This is the most common sense thing that we can do, and there's no reason that we shouldn't. And when we look at the proposal coming from our colleagues across the aisle, it raises taxes on dividends. Probably not a smart thing to do, as when you look at senior citizens, many of them who depend on their dividend income, they're going to get whacked by your proposal. And under your proposal, not only do we tax small business people, but, oh yeah, the death tax comes back in full force because it fails to address one of the most penalizing parts of our tax code. I believe that the proposal that my colleague, Mr. Camp, and his committee have brought forward is a reasonable, responsible approach, and I would urge its passage.
Gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Levin.
I yield myself 15 seconds.
Gentleman is recognized for 15 seconds.
Look, no one here should distort the fact. Joint tax, 97% of small business people would keep all of their tax cuts. And in the Speaker's district, there are 144 people with income over $1 million compared to the 300,000 plus. He's sacrificing the middle class for a few with over $1 million. I now have the pleasure of yielding 2 minutes to the very distinguished gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Clyburn.
Gentleman from South Carolina is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank Mr. Levin for yielding me the time and for his leadership on this very important issue. And I rise in strong opposition to this legislation. South Carolina, my home state, is home to many military installations. Fort Jackson in Columbia, Shaw Air Force Base, and the 3rd Army Headquarters in Sumter, the Joint Air Base in Charleston, Parris Island, and the Marine Air Station in Beaufort. I proudly work to represent these military communities, and I oppose H.R. 8 because of the hurt it would visit upon middle-income and military families. A new report out today by the Center for American Progress documents the harsh impact that H.R. 8 would have on many military families. For example, a private in the United States Army in his first year of service who is married with an infant child would have a $273 increase on the H.R. 8. Now that's real money to a young soldier. A Marine corporal with 4 years of service who is married and has 2 children will see a tax increase of $448 on the H.R. 8. That family is already struggling to make ends meet. And finally, Mr. Speaker, a military police sergeant in the Air Force with 8 years service, a spouse, and 3 young children would get a whopping tax increase of $1,118 on the H.R. 8. Mr. Speaker, these are just 3 examples of how the Republican bill would negatively impact our military families. The Senate has passed a middle-class tax cut, and the President has told us he will sign it. The only thing standing between the middle income and their tax cut is the Republican leadership in this House. Mr. Speaker, it is time that we come together and extend to the middle class in this society an income tax cut that is fair, that will create jobs, that will offer security to the families and stability to communities. I urge a vote against this bill.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Camp.
I yield myself 15 seconds, and I would just say that the gentleman's remarks refer to the stimulus bill, a failed stimulus bill that was promised to create, unemployment of under 8%. Frankly, it's never been there. For 40 months, we've been over 8%. These are spending items that failed in the stimulus program. That program did not work. And at this time, I yield 2 minutes to the distinguished member of the Ways and Means Committee, the gentleman from Louisiana, Dr. Boustany.
Gentleman from Louisiana is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in support of this very important legislation. The administration and congressional Democrats seek to raise taxes on America's families, small businesses, and job creators. There's a very clear choice here. Either we can let small business owners, the job creators, America's entrepreneurs, create jobs, or we can follow the path that they're advocating over here, and that is tax small businesses. I stand in strong support of creating American jobs. Over 940,000 business owners will see higher taxes if the President and Washington Democrats are allowed to raise the top two rates. This means over half of our nation's small businesses will see higher taxes at a cost of over 700,000 fewer jobs for Americans. Over 700,000 fewer jobs for Americans. Allowing these tax cuts to expire will hurt middle-class families. If we pass this, the average taxpayer in my state of Louisiana will see tax relief of almost, on average, about $1,800. The average family of four earning $50,000 per year could face tax increases of $2,200 per family if these cuts expire. A single parent earning $36,000 per year could see tax increases of $1,100 if these provisions expire. Mr. Speaker, this administration continues its assault on the American family and the American businesses with its tax and spend policies. Our country can't afford it. Certainly America's families and businesses can't afford it. What we need is this one-year extension to allow us to move forward with a real comprehensive approach to tax reform. We have a real opportunity to do what's right for America, to promote American competitiveness. This is the moment. Let's seize it. Let's do it. But we need to take this step today to get us where we can move to that next step and that next point. So I urge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle, let's quit dilly-dallying around with this. Let's show some leadership for the American people. They want us to step up and be leaders and solve some of these problems. Let's step up and be leaders. Let's extend these provisions, move forward with a 21st century tax code. I yield back.
Gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Levin.
I now yield 2 minutes to the very distinguished member of our committee, Mr. Crowley from the great state of New York.
Gentleman from New York is recognized for 2 minutes.
I thank my good friend from Michigan for yielding me this time. I rise in strong opposition to H.R. 8. The reason I oppose this bill is because this bill will impose taxes on hundreds of thousands of U.S. military families, our heroes. That's right. Of the millions facing a tax hike, hundreds of thousands are U.S. military families. Let's call this bill what it is. It is the Republicans' tax hike on our Heroes Act. Now, I know those on the other side of the aisle will come down here one by one and claim they are extending tax cuts for everyone. But you're extending tax cuts for people earning over $1 million a year and raising taxes on families earning under $45,000 a year. This bill scales back tax breaks put in place by President Obama and directly aimed at benefiting working families. Let's take a moment to put a face on the 25 million Americans whose taxes will go up, including hundreds of thousands of U.S. military families. If you're an Air Force staff sergeant with 8 years of service, a spouse and 3 young children here stateside, at home, the Republican tax hike on our Heroes Act will raise their taxes by $1,100. A new recruit, a private in the U.S. Army, in their first year of service, earning a little over $18,000 a year. $18,000 a year. Men and women on the front line defending our freedom. If they are married with an infant child at home, they will see an increase under this bill of $273, a tax increase under the Republican tax hike on our Heroes Act. It begs the question, how are my colleagues who represent Fort Hamilton and Brooklyn going to vote on the Republican tax hike on our Heroes Act? Are you going to stand with your military family constituents or with the 2%? How are my colleagues who represent Fort Dixon, New Jersey, going to vote on the Republican...
An additional 15 seconds.
Gentleman is recognized for an additional 15 seconds.
On the Republican tax on our Heroes Act. My colleagues who represent Fort Bragg in North Carolina, Fort Detrick in Maryland, Fort Monroe in Virginia, Rock Island Arsenal in Illinois, Beale Air Force Base in California. Today the choice is clear. Stand with Democrats and the President who have put forward a plan that simply asks America's wealthiest to support this great land.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Camp.
Thank you. At this time, I yield 1 minute to a distinguished member of the Ways and Means Committee, the gentleman from Minnesota, Mr. Paulson.
Gentleman from Minnesota is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the chairman for yielding. And Mr. Speaker, last week I took part in a roundtable conversation in my district with over 20 small business leaders. They discussed the devastating impact that these looming tax hikes would have on job creation, not only across the country, but in Minnesota. The sentiment that was echoed throughout that entire conversation was that Washington should not be raising taxes when our economy is still struggling to recover. These job creators understand all too well what our country is facing as we approach on January 1st this tax cliff, this fiscal cliff, this jobs cliff. And the message from all of these entrepreneurs was simple. Job creators and business leaders alike were saying very directly, stop the tax hike. Studies have shown that this looming tax hike would negatively impact half of all small business income, a loss of 700,000 jobs potentially. 14,500 of those jobs are in my home state of Minnesota, Mr. Speaker. But if we extend these rates and we move towards tax reform, we can have a positive impact on our economy of 1 million new jobs. Mr. Speaker, the choice is clear. With the national unemployment rate at over 8% for 41 consecutive months, we must stop the tax hike. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Levin.
I yield myself 15 seconds.
Gentleman is recognized.
Look, I want to repeat, joint tax says 97% of